When you picture medieval people, do you see mud-caked peasants who never bathed and smelled like a barn? What if I told you that image is almost entirely wrong, and the stinkiest part isn't even what you think? Get ready to toss out what you learned from movies, because in the next few minutes, you'll discover that medieval folks worked surprisingly hard to stay clean, even if deodorant wasn't a thing yet. Let's talk about this classic mental picture. A whole medieval village smelling like old socks. Peasants with dirt smeared all over them. Kids running around with faces so grimy you'd think soap was illegal, and a general stench you can almost see swirling around the streets. That's the image that pops up in every movie, and honestly, in most history classrooms too. The story goes that everyone back then was just gross. Picture a world where everyone supposedly smells like they've been wrestling pigs for fun, and bathing was a once-in-a-lifetime event. If that. But is any of this true, or are we just victims of a very long-running smear campaign? It turns out the whole medieval people never bathed idea owes a lot more to Victorian snobbery and Hollywood drama than it does to actual history. The Victorians had a real knack for making themselves seem better than people who came before them, especially when it came to hygiene. Back in the 19th century, writers needed a way to make their modern plumbing and soap obsessions feel like the peak of civilization. So, they painted the Middle Ages as a dirty, disease-ridden mess, where everyone was one step away from turning into a mud creature. Hollywood jumped on that image and turned it up to 11. Suddenly, every medieval movie had poor characters trudging through sewage, feasting with their hands caked in grease, and laughing with a few brown teeth sticking out. But if you actually step back and look at source material from the Middle Ages themselves, things get interesting. Medieval towns and cities were jam-packed with bathhouses, and not just a couple tucked away on some forgotten street. We're talking about huge public bathhouses, with water heated in massive tubs. Walk through London, Paris, or Prague, and you'd find bathhouses around the corner, open to men, women, and even kids. Families or friends would sometimes rent out private rooms or go as a group. These were the medieval version of the local pool, with less chlorine and more herbal steam. Some were fancy, with heated floors, musicians to entertain you, and meals served during your soak. Of course, not every place was glamorous. Like any community hangout, some bathhouses had a reputation for being a little seedy, which is where the rumors started. And this is where the story twists. Around the late Middle Ages, the church in Europe started preaching against public bathhouses because they worried people were having too much fun in there, if you get what I mean. Bathhouses became tangled up with talk of immorality and all sorts of wild rumors. Suddenly, bathing in public wasn't just about getting clean, it was supposedly about everything the church didn't like. Naturally, some people started avoiding them, or at least talking about them like they were dens of wickedness. Add a few spicy stories about what went on behind closed doors, and you've got the perfect excuse for later writers to say, see, they were gross. At the same time, things were changing in the world of table manners. For centuries, Europeans ate with their hands, so washing up before and after meals was a big deal. Nobody wanted dinner guests licking mud off their fingers. But a new trend swept through the wealthy classes: using forks. The fork showed up in Italy first, and, like anything new, got a lot of side eye. Over time, though, once forks made hand-to-mouth eating less common, some of the old rituals around scrubbing up before meals faded, at least for those rich enough to afford forks. And once meal hygiene practices changed, people started rewriting the narrative. The more things shifted, the easier it was for later generations to cast the forkless ages as filthy. It wasn't just public baths and forks. Archaeological digs have found everything from bathhouse ruins in English towns to wooden combs and bronze hand-washing bowls buried with people who died hundreds of years ago. Monasteries even kept careful notes about proper hand hygiene. Washing before prayers, meals, basically any time you left cow dung behind and wanted to avoid eating it along with your bread. Soap wasn't just found in the wild, either. Pieces of soap, and even old soap recipes, have turned up in medieval records. Sure, it was a bit more rustic than your favorite brand, but people made and used it for cleaning both bodies and clothes. So where does that leave us? If you're waiting for the aha moment, here it is. The idea that medieval people sat around in their own filth was cooked up long after they were gone, mostly by writers who wanted to feel better about the smell of their own cities. Take a step back, and you see this wasn't really about medieval people at all. It was just a handy way for later folks to boost their egos by pretending the past was grosser than the present. That begs another question, though. If medieval life wasn't quite as disgusting as you've been told, how come people back then still smelled so different by our standards? Let's peel back another layer of this myth and talk about what was really behind those medieval scents. If you're still wondering why medieval people had a reputation for smelling strong, let's get real about their everyday lives. First, try to erase everything you know about your morning routine. No deodorant. No steamy showers. No washing machines humming in the background. Instead, picture getting dressed in a scratchy linen shirt and pulling on layers of wool or leather. Except these aren't the comfortable modern versions. Wool soaks up sweat and body oils like a sponge. And there you are, spending your day hustling in the fields or sweating by the forge. The strong scent you're imagining wasn't just from skipping bath time. Most of it came straight from hard work, old-fashioned fabrics, and the basic lack of what we see as hygiene essentials. The real winner in the scent category was the absence of deodorant. Medieval folks simply didn't have armpit roll-ons or fancy sprays promising 48-hour protection. Their options looked more like a medieval apothecary than the body spray aisle. If you wanted less stink, you rubbed herbs under your arms or dabbed on homemade mixtures hoping for the best. For the average person, a slightly spicy armpit was pretty normal. Soap, when you had access to it, wasn't the chemical-laden, floral-smelling stuff you find today. It was made from animal fat or leftover ashes, and it was pretty precious, so you usually saved it for laundry or the occasional deep clean. You wouldn't believe what natural fibers could do to a person's perfume. Linen was the closest thing they had to climate control. Medieval people wore linen undergarments right next to their skin because linen was breathable and could soak up sweat. On the downside, once it got wet or dirty, linen kept those smells locked in. Now, imagine not throwing your shirts into a washing machine every couple of days. Laundry happened, but it was a process, scrubbing everything by hand, drying it out in the sun, and hoping it wouldn't rain. If you were rich, you had extra clothes to switch out. If you weren't, well, you simply aired things out and accepted that you wouldn't pass a modern sniff test. Diet plays a sneaky role, too. If you compare your weekly grocery list to a medieval one, you'll notice some dramatic differences. Sugar was rare for regular people. That was good news for their teeth, but no amount of sugar skipping could cancel out body odor. Instead, they loaded up on onions, garlic, and hearty, preserved meats. Meals were basic, sometimes bland, and always made with what you could grow or store over long, cold winters. The result? You got used to smelling, well, like someone who ate a lot of garlic stew. There wasn't any Mountain Dew or leftover pizza. Spices were expensive, so the average person's body odor took cues from wild herbs, fermented bread, and whatever was bubbling away in the communal cooking pot. But diet was just the beginning of medieval smells. The environment itself mixed and mingled with every whiff of daily life. Heat your home with an open fire and your clothes, hair, and skin all end up smelling smoky. Forget about insulated walls. If you were inside, you'd still be catching scents of the animals living nearby, sometimes even sharing your roof. Seasonal changes mattered. In summer, everyone sweated more, and in winter, you'd huddle together with a few dozen unwashed furry companions. Showers of rain turned dirt roads into mud slicks, and city air was shaped by whatever animals were on their way to market. You didn't even need to be outside to notice. Everything stuck to you, and the medieval version of spring cleaning involved dumping smelly straw and putting down fresh stuff, sometimes laced with flowers or herbs if you could spare them. Now, here's the pattern interrupt. While the overall smell might have been more authentic, the people themselves didn't walk around scandalized by body odor. They were nose blind. To put it simply, medieval people lived in a world before chemical scents. No air fresheners, no perfume counters, no shampoo commercials telling you how you're supposed to smell. If your whole street, school, or town smelled roughly the same as you, what's there to complain about? Social class did have an effect on the olfactory parade. Wealthy folks weren't showing off with perfectly crisp shirts. Instead, they used scented gloves, splashed perfumes over their clothes, and placed dried herbs in pouches around their necks. Some had the luxury of full wardrobe changes, letting yesterday's sweat dry out while they wore something slightly less ripe. The average laborer, on the other hand, made do with linen underclothes. These were easier to wash, and changing them was about as good as things got. If things got really dire, you reached for a pouch of lavender, sage, or another herb, hoping it masked at least some of the funk. So, yes, body odor was definitely stronger and different compared to what you expect today. But it wasn't a sign of laziness or filth. It was what happened when you lived in a world without synthetic scents, where everyone shared the same boat, and no one was tossing out deodorant samples on the street corner. Think medieval Europe smelled bad? Maybe, but it was just the normal scent pack that came with the times. And don't assume that means people gave up on staying as clean as they could. Their hygiene hacks were actually clever, sometimes even more creative than what you'd expect. Just wait until you hear how they pulled this off with nothing but soap, rivers, and a few ancient cleaning tricks. If you ever time traveled straight into a medieval village, all the fancy hand soaps and body washes you've ever owned would be completely useless. Your 3-step skin routine would last about 20 minutes before medieval life chewed it up and spit it out. So, if you actually wanted to keep reasonably clean back then, you had to get smart, the medieval way. Let's talk about what real cleaning looked like in a world before grocery stores and Amazon deliveries. Step 1. Making soap was basically medieval chemistry class, except you did it at home, and the stakes were higher than just failing a test. Imagine the scene. Someone in your family heats a cauldron over a fire. Into the pot goes a gnarly mix. Animal fat saved from cooking, or if you were richer, precious olive oil. Next up, the magic ingredient, lye. People made this by pouring water through a barrel of ashes, then using that caustic brew to break down the fat. Sounds scientific, and also a bit like a dare. Get it wrong, you could burn yourself, or end up with useless mush. Get it right. Congratulations, you have soap, which probably smells better than nothing, but might still remind you of a butcher shop with a hint of campfire. Homemade medieval soap was not the same everywhere, and it depended a lot on what you could get your hands on. The superstar of soaps was Castile soap, the stuff made from olive oil, prized all the way from Spain to distant corners of Europe. This soap was a luxury, costing about 2/3 of a skilled laborer's daily wage in England. If you couldn't afford a lump of Castile, you got creative with animal tallow, some salt, and whatever else was handy. Recipes could get weird. There's a 14th century manual that starts by mixing oak ashes and water for a full day to make lye, and then you add quicklime, more water, and finally boil it up with tallow, salt, and even flour. Stir that pot, let it cool in a mold, and hope nobody eats it by mistake. Bathhouses were the medieval version of the neighborhood hangout spot and public pool mashed together, except swap the smell of chlorine for clouds of herb-scented steam. In bigger cities, they were about as common as taverns, and absolutely everyone used them. Rich, poor, merchant, or mender. It was normal to drop in for a soak and a scrub, talk with friends, or grab a bite in between baths. Some bathhouses went upscale and offered meals, music, and private cubicles. Others, let's just say the cleanliness was questionable, and some places had a reputation that would make a club bouncer blush. If you picture everyone lounging in hot water all the time, reel that image back. Full-body baths were more for special occasions. Think holidays, weddings, or the occasional treat if you hit the hygiene jackpot. Daily routines focused on the basics. Lining up at a basin to wash faces, hands, and feet, either at home or with friends. The hands before supper obsession was very real, since everyone ate with their hands at shared tables. You'd even find written reminders in manuscripts from old monasteries about hand-washing before prayers and meals. Medieval people knew dirt belonged on the street, not in your bread. Laundry was not a solo act or a quick spin in the machine. It was community drama, almost a public event. Clothes got seriously dirty, so to fix that, women, and sometimes the children they could wrangle, trudged down to the river or used big wooden vats. They built fires to heat water, pounded clothes with sticks or stones, and used lye or old black soap. You didn't just scrub stains, you beat the entire week's work out of those shirts until your arms hurt. When it was done, everything dried in the wind, and if it rained, you had a pile of soggy laundry to start all over. Laundry day was so tough that in some places, laundresses in royal courts got paid almost as much as knights. Not a bad deal, considering the medieval version of a spin cycle was your own biceps. Keeping the house clean took its own set of tricks. Most medieval homes had dirt floors, so the first step was upgrading them. Covering floors with clean straw. This wasn't just for looks, either. Straw soaked up mud, crumbs, dust, and anything the family dog dragged in. To keep things smelling less like a barn and more like a garden, people sprinkled the floors with herbs and flowers. Lavender, rosemary, wild marjoram. Whatever was in season or cheap at the market. Fresh straw had to be swapped out when it got too gross, which was often, especially if livestock wandered in for a visit. Windows stayed open when the weather allowed, which helped move the air, but also let in whatever new smell the street outside was cooking up. Medieval homes didn't have the fresh fragrance of vanilla candles. Still, nobody was wading through filth every day. People made their own hacks. Soap that may have been a little funky, but still left them cleaner. Laundry routines that turned into neighborhood gossip fests, and household cleaning that relied on straw, herbs, and a stubborn sense of pride. Their noses might have missed modern perfume, but they weren't clueless about fighting dirt. That's just how they tackled body and home cleaning. But if you think the story ends at washing up and sweeping straw, you've got another thing coming. Wait until you find out what they did for dental hygiene. It gets even stranger. Nobody wants to sit next to someone whose breath could take down a dragon, right? You might assume medieval people just gave up, wandering around with mouths full of mystery meat and rotten teeth, knocking out small children with every yawn. But the truth is more complicated, and probably surprises anyone who thinks oral hygiene showed up with the first tube of mini toothpaste. Medieval people cared about their teeth and breath, maybe not with whitening strips or tiny bristled brushes, but in their own persistent way. Let's start with the basics. Keeping your mouth fresh wasn't just a personal choice, It was seen as a sign of health and good manners. In fact, there are written records giving advice about rinsing your mouth with water as soon as you wake up, specifically to remove overnight mucus. It's not glamorous, but this step set the tone for everything else that followed. Nobody was brushing for 2 minutes while secretly planning a dentist escape, but you wouldn't believe how much attention some people gave to their teeth. Before the first meal, rinsing was just the starting line. Now, fast forward a few centuries. Imagine cleaning your teeth with things you grab out of the garden or even the tree outside. People used green hazel shoots, basically chewing on fresh sticks, and Welsh folks especially liked rubbing their teeth with bits of green wood and woolen cloth. There's even a story about the Welsh having teeth that shone like ivory, all because of their dedication to daily scrubbing. Back then, white teeth weren't just cosmetic, they were a big part of looking healthy and attractive. And the tools? Ingenious, if a little primitive by modern standards. Modern mouth rinses come in every color, often promising Arctic blast or charcoal detox, but medieval solutions were all about herbs and flavor. A 13th century physician named Gilbert the Englishman advised people to rub their teeth with herbal powders. Think mint or marjoram for a fresh taste. There was a warning in there too. Don't use hot spices, or you could accidentally make things worse and cause decay. Some cleaning plans even suggested rubbing your teeth with linen after eating and drying them carefully so there wasn't any leftover food to turn into putrid matter. The logic is solid. Leftover food leads to bad breath, so if you can't scrub it away, you at least wipe it away. But let's talk toothpaste. The medieval version, anyway. Imagine stirring together sage and salt crystals, or smashing rosemary charcoal into a powder. These homemade blends were gently abrasive and aromatic, enough to scrub gunk off your teeth, while hopefully improving your breath at the same time. It makes sense. Plants were the only pharmacy you had, so you made do with whatever grew in the hedgerow or your kitchen garden. Mouthwash also wasn't off the table. Vinegar or wine mixed with herbs was a common quick option, acting as both a rinse and a breath freshener. If you needed to mask something truly ferocious, chewing on a handful of mint, sage, or cardamom worked in a pinch. Halitosis wasn't invented in modern times, and even when you're living on cabbage and salt pork, no one wants to be the person everyone inches away from at dinner. While modern junk food gets the blame for rotten teeth, medieval diets actually helped most people avoid the worst mouth disasters. There just wasn't much sugar around, which meant the bacteria that wreck teeth had less to work with. Archaeological research found only about 20% of teeth from medieval graves had cavities, compared to the dental disaster unleashed by sugar in later centuries. Sugar was expensive and rare, so unless you were royalty or very rich, you mostly skipped it. More importantly, eating hard bread, fibrous vegetables, and rough grains did some of the scrubbing work, cleaning off plaque and leftover food just by chewing. Of course, not everything was perfect. Medieval people had some odd ideas too, like believing that toothworms nibbled away inside your molars, causing all kinds of pain. Toothaches weren't handled with a trip to the dentist, but with candle burning near teeth hoping to smoke the worms out, or, for those brave enough, heading to a barber surgeon for a good old-fashioned extraction. No numbing, lots of drama. Clean hands mattered just as much as clean teeth. Washing before food wasn't just a medieval trend. It became basic etiquette. Piles of old manuscripts remind readers over and over. If you're eating, at least try to scrub the outside first. This habit stuck around for centuries, even as forks and spoons replaced sticky fingers. On special occasions, people turned to perfumes, scented gloves, and herbal sachets, especially if they were worried their natural aroma might overpower the roast pheasant. It all comes down to this. Medieval folks understood that keeping breath fresh and bodies presentable was a must, not just for health, but for making friends, trading goods, and avoiding side-eye at Sunday dinner. Sometimes their fixes were clever, sometimes they were a little out there, but they clearly cared about hygiene. But after all these cleaning efforts, the question still lingers. Was medieval hygiene really as horrifying as we've all been told? Medieval people didn't stink like some cartoon villain. Sure, nobody smelled like bottled shampoo, but they were not ignorant of cleanliness and employed various methods to maintain it. Instead of rolling in grime, most folks scrubbed with homemade soap, washed hands before meals, and even chewed mint for sweet breath. Next time someone cracks a joke about filthy peasants, remember, they were cleaning with what they had, and history is always messier than the stereotype. There's way more nuance hiding under the surface. So, what's the next historical myth you want busted? Leave your pick in the comments.